Mutation Genesis from the Fempiror Chronicles by George Willson. Chapter 2. What Came Before. David had recounted the entire story to Tiberius, his mentor since the loss of Zechariah. Although David had only known Zechariah for a few days before his death, David never forgot the old man's face or attitude. Even after meeting the rest of the Rostam order and working with them, he had never met anyone whose conviction to the Rostam order matched that of Zechariah. Tiberius had been the leader of the Rostam since the Fempiror War 400 years ago, and he was the one to whom Zechariah had entrusted the care and training of David after Zechariah fell at the hands of Vladimir. Tiberius had been cautious of David in the beginning, secretly believing that David was working with the Tepish. Over time, however, David worked to earn the old leader's trust, and Tiberius remained true to his promise to Zechariah to keep David under his wing. Because of the circumstances surrounding Zechariah's death, Tiberius was well aware of Beth and David's close relationship. David and Beth had grown up together in their hometown of Hoggenstown, and only moments before his transmutation, David had asked Beth's father for her hand in marriage. Nothing more had come of that request, however, because on his short walk home, David met a Tepish of the acquisition rank of Redel Kurtz, who had injected him with the serum of the Fempiror. It was only thanks to the presence of Zechariah that the Redel Kurtz had not taken David into the Tepish fold. Following his change, David had shown little but disrespect to those who tried to help. Close enough. Following his change, David had shown little but disrespect to those who tried to help him adjust, and in the end, he betrayed them all by breaking the heart of the Rostam code in returning to Hoggenstown and unintentionally transmutating Beth. Although it had only been 10 years, he had seen much in the mounting war with the Tepish, and yet, through all he had done right and wrong since then, he had no greater regret than taking Beth's life from her. The first point of the Rostam Code was to prevent the willing transmutation of humans, and better than most Rostam, he understood why this was a capital offense. Beth had given herself to him, and he had taken away the only life she wanted, a family. He had not seen her since that night. "I never thought I'd see her again," David told Tiberius at the end of his tale. "She hasn't changed at all." "It's the nature of our race," Tiberius said, nodding. "You both look barely 18, but in reality you're 10 years older. Is that why you were overwhelmed?" David shook his head. Tiberius must have thought he was trying to sacrifice himself to save her when she was in trouble. After all, his orders were to watch for trouble and go for help if the person needed it. He was not supposed to jump into the middle of it. "I told you. I watched her scale the side of the Tepish building, climb in, and back out," David explained. "I followed her as she was chased, and jumped in to help her when she was attacked. I had no idea who she was until she spoke. I didn't even know she was still with Ulrich after he took her away." He looked at Tiberius, wondering what Tiberius really thought of him at this moment. Even David wondered if perhaps Beth's presence had clouded his judgment at the time. Tiberius looked at him with a gentle expression. David could only guess how he must look right now. Perhaps he looked like someone who had seen a ghost. He had not expected the memories of those years with Beth to come flooding back on him, or even the years without her to affect him so much. "I was unaware you even wanted to know," Tiberius finally said. David knew Tiberius was sizing up his reactions, but seeing Beth, someone he loved so completely, right beside him even for a moment after so long was a lot to bear. "No, of course not," David lied, shaking his head. "I mean, we didn't part well." "I remember," Tiberius said with a nod. 10 years ago, David blasted across the landscape outside the cave east of the old mill near Hoggenstown in the Levichart belonging to Zechariah. His simple brown-on-white outfit consisting of breeches, stockings, a shirt, and waistcoat was stained with dirt from falling down a hole into a cave a few days before. Beth Carpenter had been transmutated less than an hour earlier and rested unconscious in the seat behind him, wearing the blue and white dress she was so proud of having made herself. He had just pushed his lifelong friend, Abraham Barber, out of the way in order to leave the cave, and after having done so, he pressed the lever cart to its maximum speed. The wind whipped through his hair, but unlike the first time he had felt this rush, he did not relish the pleasure of the speed. This time, it was an unfortunate necessity. Once he was over the plains, however, he heard a noise from the back of the cart. He turned, and to his surprise, he saw Abraham desperately hanging on to the cart. David thought quickly about how to handle this. To bring Abraham with them was impossible. Abraham had failed to understand both his Fempiror condition and what had happened with Beth, and David did not believe allowing Abraham to see this Fempiror world would help at all. He glanced back again and saw Abraham grasping the leather straps in the rear portion of the cart, pulling himself onto the cart to face off against David again. David knew if he slowed the cart down too much, he would risk others catching up to them. "I can't allow you to poison the world," he heard Abraham say behind him. David turned and found his friend on his knees, barely holding himself upright against the fierce wind. David slowed the cart to just faster than a run. He knew what he had to do. He turned to Abraham. "She was an accident," David insisted once more. "No more accidents then," Abraham shouted. Abraham reached his hands out to grab David's neck, but David easily held Abraham's hands in place. Abraham struggled, but his human strength was no match for the Fempiror strength David now possessed. David broke Abraham's grip and grabbed Abraham by the upper arms, holding them firmly in place and making any further retaliation on Abraham's part impossible. David lifted his friend off the cart and carried him easily to the rear of it. He held Abraham over the ground rushing by below. He knew dropping Abraham at this speed would knock the wind out of him, but would not seriously injure him. He had no desire to hurt Abraham, but he knew that Abraham also would not go easily. He looked into his friend's eyes. "Forgive me, old friend," he said. Abraham looked back at David with blind hatred in his eyes. "I am not your friend," he said. "I will hunt you till the day I die." "I know," David said. "Take care." And with that, he dropped Abraham from the back of the cart. He watched Abraham roll for a moment until he came to a stop. Abraham slowly crawled to his hands and knees. He would live. David jumped back into the front seat and pushed the controls forward to get them back to the western mountains as fast as possible. He pulled back on the right lever to veer to the north and curve back around to head west to the Erufdium Plateau. His mission now was to get Beth back to Tiberias and await Zechariah's return. As he passed to the north of the old mill, he noticed with horror that the mill was in flames. Orders or not, he was immediately concerned for Zechariah. While he was certain that Zechariah was more than capable of handling himself, he did not know what transpired between him and Vladimir, and he wanted to be sure Zechariah survived. The last thing David expected to see was the mill burning to the ground. He turned back toward the cave to see if there might be any evidence that Zechariah escaped the inferno. He thought perhaps if the chaser were gone, then he would have hope that Zechariah survived his encounter with Vladimir and the flames of the townspeople. The door to the mill was on the south side, and it appeared that the townspeople maintained their presence on that side, which allowed David to approach the cave to the east of the mill from the north. He pulled into the cave and stopped near the hole that he and Beth had created only days before. Burning ashes from the mill fluttered down the hole into the cave and snuffed out on the dirt floor. The chaser was gone, which David considered a good sign. Just to be sure, he walked under the hole and looked up. The fire raged through the mill above. The light from the fire flickered down the walls of the hole, and everything above was a bright orange. "Zechariah!" David called out. Only the sound of the flames consuming the old structure sounded down to him. The lack of answer was only a partial relief. It meant that either Zechariah had escaped, or he was already dead, and would at least not suffer from the burning of the mill. He was uncertain as to what he hoped to find here. He would have to go back to Erufdium to find out if Zechariah did arrive, but by then it would be too late to do anything. He turned back to the Levicart, wondering if he should wait for the fire to die out enough to see what remained, or accept that there was nothing more to do here and leave now. Suddenly, a body fell to the ground in a heap out of the hole. David whipped around and ran to the smoke-darkened form on the ground. He rolled the body over to find Zechariah staring up at him. The old Rostim had one bloody hand over a wound in his stomach, and his sword in the other. Zechariah smiled. "Can't you do what you're told?" he asked weakly. David laughed in spite of the situation. "Zechariah, what happened?" David asked. "Vladimir won," Zechariah forced out weakly. "Beware of him." "What do I do?" David asked. "Take my body with you," Zechariah told him. David thought that maybe this should have been obvious, but he did not want to break any other rules this evening. He was already in more than enough trouble. David walked to the cart and moved Beth to the front seat. He returned to Zechariah and gently lifted his body to rest him in the back seat of the cart. David jumped back into the front seat, turned the cart around, and blasted back out of the cave. He circled the cart back around to head west again, and glanced back to see the old mill, that symbol of the secrecy of his and Beth's relationship, appropriately collapse in flames. The distance from the old mill to the Erufdium plateau passed by in an instant. David could think of nothing besides his 2 passengers, and he knew that he was responsible for this entire situation. If he had only listened, Beth would be safely asleep along with the rest of the town, and Zechariah would be enjoying a victory celebration with the other Rostim and the Alewo of the Dark West. Now Beth lay unconscious as a Fempiror, and Zechariah was slowly dying. He would be lucky if they let him live upon his arrival. He approached the Erufdium plateau and quickly scanned the walls of caves and openings until he found the one in which they had originally stopped not 24 hours ago. This cave was especially significant because the rear of it held a door that opened into the hold that David had taken the chaser from earlier this evening. He pulled the cart into the cave and stopped it only inches from the rear wall. He jumped out of the cart and stood at the rock wall he had opened himself only a few hours earlier. "Can you hear me?" David called out to the wall. "Please, Tiberius, Ulrich, anyone." The wall opened inward, and David did not pause to see who opened it. He jumped back in the Levicart and flew into the chamber. A glance behind him revealed that Yori had opened the door. She looked at his passengers for only an instant, and then immediately ran out of the room. As David stopped the cart, he could hear her calling out to Tiberius in the cave. David could feel his stomach leap into his throat as he imagined how badly this would go for him. He lowered the short legs of the cart and turned off the power, lowering the cart to the ground. Seconds later, Tiberius and Ulrich ran into the room. Tiberius looked at Zechariah and then Beth. David could see Tiberius piecing the situation together before his gaze darkened, and he looked to David. Anger welled behind Tiberius' eyes such as David had never seen in his life. Tiberius drew his sword and held it before him facing David. "Get out," Tiberius said shortly. Fearful for his life, David climbed out of the cart and stood sheepishly before Tiberius. David glanced back to Ulrich, who stood expressionless watching the exchange. Tiberius' breathing had shallowed considerably as he struggled for words. You had this," he said. "Tiberius," David began. "What do you think you can say?" Tiberius exclaimed. "What can possibly explain this?" "Tiberius," Zechariah said weakly from the back of the cart. Tiberius' gaze shot to Zechariah. He rushed to Zechariah's side, dropped his sword next to the cart, took Zechariah's hand, and looked into his face. "Old friend," Tiberius said, sorrow breaking through. Zechariah opened his eyes and looked at Tiberius. "It was Vladimir," he said. "He betrayed us." David stepped away from the cart and stood behind Tiberius. Tiberius nodded to David as he moved. "Did he lead you into a trap?" Zechariah shook his head and chuckled. "No, He is naive, Zechariah said. He changed the girl by coupling with her. I hope you will be able to break him of his insolence. Ulrich glanced at David, his expression never changing. At the mention of David having changed Beth, he wondered what thoughts lurked behind those old eyes, but Ulrich revealed nothing. He solemnly walked past David around the front of the cart to look over Beth, resting in the left side of the front seat of the cart. What about you? Tiberius asked Zechariah. I will not survive, Zechariah said. If I had not heard David's voice, I would have stayed to burn, so no accidents would occur. You're certain there is nothing we can do? Tiberius asked. I am, Zechariah said. He smiled at Tiberius. It's finally my time. For the first time since David met him, Tiberius looked to be on the verge of tears. Goodbye, Tiberius, Zechariah said. Be to him what you were to me. My sword is his. Rest in peace, Zechariah, Tiberius said gently. I finally will, Zechariah said with a smile, and closed his eyes for the last time. Tiberius continued to hold Zechariah's hand. He closed his eyes and a tear fell down his cheek. Gently he lowered Zechariah's hand, resting it on his late friend's chest. He rose to his feet and stood next to the levicart for what felt like a very long time, looking at his lost friend. 400 years we stood together, Tiberius said, unmoving. Through everything we had lost, he was the one I was certain would outlive us all. Never was there a Rostem more devoted to the code he helped to create. Never was there a swordsman who could match him. Never was there a heart more selfless than the one that has stopped beating today. Even after he left Aram, I knew we all were a little safer because Zechariah was out there. Never has the Fempiror world experienced a greater loss than this. He was unique. May he be forever remembered. The room was silent. Slowly Tiberius bent down and picked up his sword. He held it without turning for a moment before he sheathed it. He slowly turned to David, who took a step back from Tiberius' hurt and angry stare. Tiberius took a deep breath to contain his grief before speaking. Whatever he saw in you, Tiberius said, struggling behind his emotion, it has saved you from me. You are lucky I am sane, and that I honor his memory. I should cut you down where you stand. Yes, sir, David responded. He could say little else. Tiberius should take his life now, but instead Zechariah had lived long enough to give David into Tiberius' care. Then, to solidify David's passage into the Rostem way, Zechariah had given David his sword. David knew it would be something he would treasure for as long as he lived, for it was a possession bought at the cost of another's life. It would be a reminder of what he did wrong these first few days, and ensure that he followed the code unfailingly going forward. Where am I? Beth said suddenly in a panic. Who are you? David? In the passing of Zechariah, David had momentarily forgotten his other mistake of the evening. He had taken 2 lives. He ran to Beth's side, and Ulrich took a step back to allow David to take Beth's hand. I'm here, David said gently. She turned to him, fear set deep in her eyes. What happened? She asked. Where am I? What is going on? The older Fempiror stood around silently. It was something else he had to explain, and they were leaving the explaining to him. He was uncertain how to begin. He knew she only barely believed him earlier that evening, and now she had to accept it, regardless of what she thought of his story. He knew this would end badly. It was an accident, he said apologetically. A terrible accident. What was? She asked, still panicking. What do you mean? Who are these people? You remember how I told you I couldn't come home because I changed? David reminded her. Her expression changed to one of shock and disbelief. Yes, she said hesitantly. What we did in the mill changed you, he said. I didn't know it would. What? She asked, confusion stretching across her face. David closed his eyes and decided to spout it all out at once. You can't go home, he said. You can't go out into the sun. You are no longer like our family and friends. You are a Fempiror. He opened his eyes and looked at her. She was still looking at him, but now her expression had gone completely blank, as if he had told her that her entire family was lost in a terrible accident. Truly, this was not much different. Like a spectre, she rose to her feet and walked away from him. She held her hands out as if she were trying to search for the words to say. "Never go home?" she asked. "Never," he responded. She stood motionless, silently staring at the rock door they had come in and had since been shut. He was not sure whether he should say anything else or not. He glanced around him, and the other Fempiror remained where they had been since Beth awakened. No one offered any assistance or words. They had collectively decided to leave this process entirely to him. Considering how badly he had handled this evening so far, he would have welcomed any ideas they might have to make this easier. He looked at Tiberius specifically, but the old Fempiror did not meet his gaze at all. He looked back to Beth and thought he might offer the positive side of the problem. "We can be together now, though," he began, but apparently this was not what she wanted to hear. She spun around, anger etched on her face. "Oh, we can," she said. "Was that the plan? Is that why you came back? I can never see my family, who I cherish above all other things on this earth, but I get you as a consolation prize? What makes you think I want to have you now? You took everything away from me. Everything." "Beth, it was an accident," he said desperately. "Convenient accident, David," she yelled. "Oh, I was a fool to pity you and think that we were saying goodbye when the whole time you were taking me into your net." "No, Beth, it isn't like that," he said, walking toward her. "I didn't know. I would never get away from me," she shouted. She turned around and punched David using her newfound strength. It was the last thing David expected, so he took the hit full on, flew across the chamber, hit the opposite wall, and then crashed to the floor. Even still, none of the other Fempiror in the room moved. Beth watched him for a moment, her hands shaking. Her mouth hung open in disbelief. Finally, she dropped to her knees and bawled into her hands. David rose uneasily to his feet and looked at her. As if sensing that their conversation was over, the room came back to life. Ulrich moved toward Beth and looked at Tiberius as he knelt beside her. "You are pledged to that one," he said. "I will care for this one." Tiberius nodded. Ulrich gently wrapped his arms around Beth and lifted her easily off the ground. Her tears continued, and she never once glanced at David as Ulrich carried her out of the room and out of David's sight. David could only watch her go, powerless to prevent Ulrich from taking her. Tiberius walked up behind him. "We leave tomorrow," Tiberius said simply, his voice indicating his reluctance to bring David at all. "What about Beth?" David asked. "She is in good hands," Tiberius clipped, and then walked past David into the main cave. David dropped to his knees beside Zechariah's cart as everyone else left the room, leaving him completely alone. He knew how it had come to this, and he did not want to believe it. Before he had learned the truth, he had wanted to change Beth so they could be together, and now when he had done it accidentally, he lost her anyway. He closed his eyes, and somewhere through his tears in the lonely air of that room, he had fallen asleep. David stared at the ceiling, still lying on his cot. Tiberius had taken David in and trained him as a Rostem, just as he had promised Zechariah on that night. Once they had left Erufdium, David had embraced his new life and become one of the best fighters of the Order. Through many, many battles, he had earned the respect and trust of Tiberius, as well as the other Rostem who witnessed his mistake 10 years ago. With his head flooded with those memories, David sat up. "I thought that I had forgotten about her," he said, "but instead I find that my feelings remain. How is that possible?" "There are some people you never forget," Tiberius said, "and some feelings that never change. You haven't spoken of her since then, and without something to change how you feel, there is no reason to believe your feelings would change. Much like marking your place in a book. You open it up years later, and the story remains the same. You haven't turned any pages." "Is it possible to see her again?" David asked. "That is not my decision," Tiberius said with a shrug. "The Alewo keep their positions secret, just as we keep ours. If Ulrich and I had not been meeting, you might have found yourself in a tight spot earlier. But surely you have some way of contacting them, David insisted. We have preset meeting times for which messengers of both disciplines exchange messages. Then I may send a message to her by this route. Now is not the time, David, Tiberius said, trying to settle David down. The Tepish are up to something, and our next meeting will determine our course of action. I need you to be there. If you have anything to say, you may do so at that time, though you may find that the time for sending messages has passed. I'm supposed to be there? David asked, surprised. Yes, Tiberius said. Why? David asked. This was very strange indeed. Tiberius had never asked David to attend any of these meetings with Ulrich. With the Tepish attempting to watch their every move, they kept their groups to a bare minimum. Ulrich and Tiberius only kept in touch to share what their groups had learned, and then passed that information down into their ranks. In addition, even though David was under the tutelage of Tiberius, it was the place of others considered higher in the order to accompany Tiberius to the Rostim-Alewo meetings when the need arose. Ulrich and I think you may be able to help with this new Tepish problem, Tiberius asked. How? David asked. If I tell you now, we wouldn't need the meeting, Tiberius responded with a smile. David was not sure how to respond, since this type of humor was not Tiberius' normal method of communication. He was certain something was going on, but he could not begin to fathom what that would be. I don't mean to seem rude, David, Tiberius said, noticing David's confusion. But there are some details about this operation that we'll need to discuss in the meeting this next evening. Ulrich and I have been going over this together for quite some time, and it would be better to be patient and allow us to explain everything when we get there. David nodded. What else could he do? Tiberius was not going to tell him any more about it, so all he could do was practice the patience that had never been his friend.